The eerie beginning of the night shift. Dr. Lucas Hale had just clocked in for his night shift at the hospital morgue. As a young resident, he had been assigned the late hours on more than one occasion, but tonight felt different. There was something about the morgue, the cold, sterile silence that sent a shiver down his spine. The hum of the refrigeration unit seemed louder than usual, filling the air with a mechanical noise that did nothing to calm his nerves. The lights overhead flickered, casting brief shadows on the walls. It was as though the morgue itself was alive, watching him. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the bodies were arranged in their refrigerated drawers, as always. But as Lucas checked each one, he felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. His breath fogged in the air, even though the morgue's cooling systems were set to a consistent, controlled temperature. Despite the dead stillness of the room, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking behind those metal doors. Each time he opened one, he felt eyes on him, though no one was there. His mind raced as he tried to dismiss the feeling, but it stuck with him. Something was wrong, something beyond the chill in the air. As the clock struck midnight, Lucas began his rounds, checking each of the bodies in the refrigeration units. They were cold and motionless, as expected. But then, as he checked a man who had passed away 2 days ago, something caught his eye. The body's fingers twitched. Lucas froze. His first instinct was to attribute it to a simple muscle spasm. After all, it wasn't uncommon for a body to react briefly to sudden temperature changes. But this wasn't a simple twitch. The fingers curled slowly, then relaxed as though the body was trying to move. He stepped back, heart racing. He glanced around the room, expecting to see something move in the shadows, but the morgue remained silent. Was it a hallucination? A trick of the light or his tired mind? Lucas hesitated, staring at the twitching hand for what felt like an eternity, unsure if he should investigate further. But before he could gather his thoughts, the hand remained still again, frozen in place. He convinced himself that it was just his nerves playing tricks on him. Yet, as he continued his rounds, a feeling of unease lingered. Something was terribly wrong, and Lucas couldn't shake the suspicion that the night was just beginning. As the minutes passed, Lucas tried to focus on his work, checking each body with a professional detachment. But the sense of foreboding grew stronger. He had always been able to manage night shifts in the morgue without any issue, but tonight was different. There was an energy in the air, something unsettling, like an unseen presence. He pulled open the next refrigerated drawer, his fingers trembling. The body inside was that of a woman, her face pale and waxy, her limbs stiff. She had been deceased for nearly a week. Lucas checked her vitals, confirming her death, but as he did, he noticed something odd. Her fingers twitched. Not as subtly as before, but more deliberately, almost as if she were trying to reach out. His heart skipped a beat. Could this really be happening? Was this just another trick of the morgue's cold air playing with his senses? But the movements were too real, too deliberate to be written off as simple muscle spasms. Lucas stepped back, feeling a chill crawl up his spine. He checked the temperature of the refrigeration unit. It was normal. The body shouldn't be moving, not like this. Lucas glanced around, his eyes darting nervously across the room. The only sound was the hum of the machines, but he could hear a faint whisper in the air, so soft that it could have been the wind. "Help me." It was barely audible, almost lost in the sound of the refrigeration units, but it was there. His mind raced. Could it be the woman speaking? Was she trying to communicate from beyond the grave? Lucas recoiled, suddenly unsure of himself. The coldness in the room felt more intense now, as if the walls were closing in on him. He couldn't be sure if it was his exhaustion or something much more sinister at play, but the voices were growing louder. "Help me." The whisper echoed again, more desperate this time. It sent a wave of terror through him, and for a moment, he stood, frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The whispering continued. Lucas couldn't ignore it. The voice, though faint, seemed to carry an undeniable sense of urgency. He glanced around the room, trying to make sense of the situation. Was someone else in the morgue? He would have heard them. The doors were locked, the security cameras were functional. There was no way anyone could have entered without him noticing. Yet there it was again. "Help me, please." The voice seemed to be coming from the body of the woman he had just checked. He looked down at her, and for a moment, he could have sworn that her eyes were slightly open, just enough to reveal a sliver of white beneath her lids. The morgue had always been cold, but tonight it felt as though the temperature had dropped even further. The air was so frigid that it burned his lungs with every breath. Lucas's heart raced and his hands trembled as he looked over the body. The woman's lips were barely moving, but the words kept coming, rasping through the stillness of the morgue. "Help me. Please." Lucas felt the need to run, to get out of there, but he couldn't. His legs felt like lead, and he couldn't tear his eyes away from the woman's body. He leaned in closer, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was he hearing things? Or was the woman somehow still alive? He couldn't explain it, but the voice was undeniably real. A chill shot through him as the woman's eyes seemed to lock onto his. The terror in her expression was enough to freeze him in place. She was no longer just a lifeless corpse. She was something else, something trapped between life and death. Her presence was suffocating, and Lucas could feel his resolve cracking under the weight of it. "Please," the whisper came again, and this time it was so clear, so filled with pain, that it felt like it was coming from inside his own mind. Shaking, Lucas backed away from the woman's body. He needed air, needed to think. He turned toward the door, but it wouldn't open. His panic began to mount. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, and his breath now billowed in the cold, visible in the dim light. He turned to leave. But then something caught his eye. One of the drawers was slightly ajar and the body inside was missing. It had been the woman's body, the one that had been laying there just moments ago, twitching and whispering. How could she have disappeared? He scrambled to check the security footage, but as he rewound the tape, he saw nothing unusual. At first. Then, in a blur, the footage flickered. He saw the woman's body standing in front of the camera, her face turned toward him. The image was grainy, but it was unmistakable. She was standing as if alive. The camera feed cut out, and in that moment, Lucas's blood ran cold. He watched in disbelief as the woman's body disappeared, leaving the drawer empty. With trembling hands, Lucas checked the other drawers, but the woman's body was nowhere to be found. His mind raced. He had to be losing it, right? This couldn't be happening. But the evidence on the screen was undeniable. He felt a wave of dread wash over him. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. The morgue was holding secrets it had no right to keep. Lucas's mind raced as he sat in front of the security monitor, watching the footage unfold. He tried to reason with himself. Perhaps there was a glitch in the camera or the footage was corrupted. But deep down he knew he was lying to himself. The image was too clear, too real. He rewound the footage, again and again, hoping it would show him something different, anything that could explain the impossible sight he had just witnessed. But each time he played it back, the woman's body stood in front of the camera, her face pale, expressionless, and her head twisted at an unnatural angle. It was as though she was waiting for something, or someone. Then, after a few moments of eerie stillness, the body would vanish, fading out of sight. It wasn't like someone simply moved it. No, it was more like she disappeared into thin air, as if she had never been there at all. Lucas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The footage didn't lie. The body was missing, and something sinister was happening in that morgue. But what could it be? He glanced at the empty room around him, the cold air, the lingering whispers. The chilling thought crossed his mind. What if the woman wasn't dead? What if she was trapped somewhere between life and death, unable to escape? He couldn't sit there any longer, paralyzed by fear. He had to investigate further. Maybe the body had been moved without his knowledge. But how could that be? He was the only one on shift, and the morgue doors were locked. The idea of someone sneaking past him in such a secure environment was absurd. Still, he had to be certain. With a pounding heart, he stood and hurried back to the refrigeration unit where the woman's body had been stored. He opened the drawer once more, bracing himself for what he might find. But when he looked inside, his breath caught in his throat. The body was there again, lying as still as before. It was as if the body had never moved, as if the horrific vision he had seen on the camera had been a figment of his imagination. But Lucas knew better now. He couldn't ignore what had happened. The woman's disappearance, the whispering voice, the eerie movements, all of it pointed to something far darker. There was a quiet, unsettling stillness in the morgue as Lucas stared at the body in front of him. It lay motionless once again, its features pale and lifeless. But something had changed. The room was colder now, the temperature dropping even further. Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a foreboding feeling that he couldn't shake. He turned away from the body, thinking it would be best to leave and get some air. But just as he took a step back, a sound broke the silence, a low creaking noise, followed by a sharp crack. He whipped around, his heart racing. The woman's body, still lifeless in appearance, was shifting. Her limbs, stiff and cold, began to twitch in a way that Lucas had never seen before. At first it was subtle, a mere movement of her fingers. But then it escalated. Her arms jerked as though struggling against invisible restraints. Her neck twisted sharply, and for a horrifying moment, her eyes snapped open. The expression on her face was one of pure terror. Her pupils dilated with fear. And then the voice returned louder now. "Help me, please!" The words seemed to pierce through the air like a physical force. Lucas took a step back, his legs trembling. His rational mind screamed at him to leave, to run as far away as possible, but his feet felt frozen to the floor. He was trapped. The woman's body continued to jerk and twist, her arms flailing as though she were trying to break free from something invisible that held her in place. The whispers grew louder, now more than just the woman's voice. Other voices joined in, whispering in agony, pleading for something, or someone, to help them. The temperature in the room dropped to an almost unbearable level, and Lucas's breath turned into visible fog. The entire morgue felt alive now, pulsing with an energy he couldn't explain. The body in front of him was no longer just a corpse. It was something more. It was a prisoner of death, trying to communicate with the living. And Lucas was its unwilling audience. The feeling of dread in the morgue intensified as Lucas continued to watch in horrified silence. The woman's body, still twitching and writhing, wasn't the only one. All around him, the other bodies were beginning to stir. It started slowly with small movements, fingers twitching, limbs jerking, then it escalated quickly. The corpses began to shift in their drawers, their stiff limbs pushing against the cold metal. One by one, the bodies began to rise. It was as if they were being drawn to something, some unseen force pulling them upright. Lucas's pulse quickened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He stepped back, his eyes darting around the room. The bodies, dead for days, even weeks, were now upright, moving, their eyes lifeless and fixed on him. The sight was incomprehensible. He had seen death up close countless times, but this was different. These were no longer just bodies, they were something else, something more sinister. The once cold, lifeless morgue had transformed into a nightmarish scene. The dead shuffled towards him, their movements stiff and jerky, their hands reaching out toward him. Lucas wanted to scream, to run, but he felt paralyzed by fear. He watched in horror as one of the bodies, a man with his throat slit open, took a slow, deliberate step toward him. His mouth hung open as though trying to say something, but no sound came out. Only a faint rasping noise like a death rattle filled the room. Lucas stumbled backward, desperately trying to regain control of his fear. But there was no escape. The bodies were closing in, and their movements were deliberate, like predators, stalking their prey. He could feel the cold, unyielding grasp of death creeping closer. And then, from behind him, he heard the woman's voice again, now louder than ever. "You can't escape," she whispered, her voice filled with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "You belong to us now." Before he could react, the woman's body was standing directly in front of him, her lifeless eyes staring straight into his. Lucas felt his breath catch in his throat. Her expression had changed. It was no longer one of fear, but one of triumph, as though she had achieved something, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. Her cold hand reached toward him, her fingers brushing against his cheek. The touch was icy, sending a jolt of fear through him. "You cannot escape," she whispered again, her voice low and cold. "You are ours now." Lucas tried to pull away, but his body refused to obey. It was as if the very air around him had thickened, as if something was holding him in place. He could feel the presence of the other bodies closing in, their cold, dead eyes fixed on him. He was surrounded, and there was nowhere to run. The woman's voice was all he could hear now, echoing in his mind. "You are part of the cycle now," she whispered. "You will never leave." Lucas's heart raced as the realization hit him. He wasn't just a witness to this nightmare, he had become part of it. The bodies, the whispers, the cold. Everything pointed to one terrifying truth. The morgue was a place where the dead were trapped, eternally rising, waiting for someone to join them. And now, Lucas was the newest addition to that collection. There was no escape. As the bodies drew closer, Lucas struggled against the unseen force holding him in place. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tightening as he realized the full extent of his situation. The morgue was not just a place for the dead to rest, it was a prison where the dead never truly left, and where the living were drawn in to take their place. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices all calling out in anguish. "You will never leave," the woman's voice repeated, now joined by dozens of others. "We are the cycle." The bodies continued to move, their cold hands reaching out for him. The woman's gaze never left him, her empty eyes now filled with a hunger that terrified him to his core. Lucas understood now. He wasn't meant to survive this night. He was meant to join them, to become just another soul trapped in this endless, tormenting cycle of death. He fought against the pull, but it was useless. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and he could feel his body stiffening, his limbs growing heavy. The chill crawled into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. And as the woman's cold hand gripped his shoulder, Lucas felt himself being pulled into the darkness. The last thing Lucas felt was the woman's icy touch. Her fingers dug into his skin, pulling him into the cold embrace of death. His vision blurred, his thoughts scattered. He could no longer move, no longer scream. The whispers of the dead surrounded him, filling his ears with their agonized pleas. And then, as everything faded to black, he understood. He had joined them. He was now one of the lost souls, trapped in this cycle of death and reanimation. In the morgue, the bodies continued to rise, their cold hands reaching for the next victim. And as the morgue doors remained sealed, the whispers would never stop. The dead were restless, and they would wait for the next soul to join them.